Friends, if you want to watch the super hit movie The Black Phone, 2022, in English, then you will surely find this discussion interesting because this film is not just another horror story, it is a movie that combines suspense, fear, and a very emotional touch. If you are visiting our channel for the first time, do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you can stay updated with more amazing movie overviews like this one. In today's video, we will talk about The Black Phone, 2022, in great detail. This movie is a supernatural horror thriller that takes you back to the late 1970s and presents a story full of mystery, abduction, childhood fear, and a touch of hope even in the darkest times. Directed by Scott Derrickson, who is already well known for creating chilling and tense atmospheres in his previous works, this film brings a different taste of horror that is not only about jump scares but also about psychological depth and survival. The movie is based on a short story written by Joe Hill, who is the son of the legendary horror writer Stephen King. This connection alone makes the expectations for this movie high because Joe Hill has a reputation for crafting dark, gripping, and emotional horror tales. The Black Phone was first introduced to select audiences during its early screening at Fantastic Fest in September 2021, where it received very positive feedback. However, its official theatrical release for the wider audience took place on June 24, 2022. It became one of the remarkable horror thrillers of that year, managing to deliver a story that is both terrifying and heartfelt at the same time. In this video, we will discuss everything you need to know about this film. We will go through its story, the background of its making, the cast members and the roles they played, how the movie was filmed, its music and sound design which added a lot to the tension, and of course, its performance at the box office. The Black Phone, 2022, is not just a horror film but also a coming-of-age story about a boy who is forced to face his fears and survive a terrifying situation. It revolves around a child abduction case in a small town and a mysterious black rotary phone that becomes a lifeline for the protagonist in an unexpected way. This phone, though disconnected, starts ringing and allows the boy to communicate with the spirits of the previous victims of a masked child killer known as the Grabber. Through these calls, the boy learns how to escape and fight back, turning his fear into strength. This movie has a runtime of around 103 minutes, but in that limited time, it creates a heavy, dark, and tense atmosphere that keeps the viewers on edge from start to finish. The production design perfectly recreates the 1970s setting with its old houses, dim streets, vintage interiors, and an unsettling neighborhood vibe where children's safety was constantly under threat. The cinematography by Brett Jutkiewicz, along with Mark Corvin's haunting music score, adds layers of unease and suspense to every frame. The sound of the black phone ringing, the silence in the basement, and the subtle background noises play an important role in building tension. One of the reasons The Black Phone stands out among modern horror movies is that it does not rely too much on gore or cheap jump scares. Instead, it focuses on psychological fear, the helplessness of a kidnapped child, and the ghostly yet guiding presence of the victims who try to help him from the other side. The lead role of Finney Blake is played by Mason Thames, who gives an emotional and believable performance as a boy torn between fear and courage. Ethan Hawke plays the Grabber, and his portrayal of this sadistic yet strangely complex villain is chilling and unforgettable. Madeline McGraw, playing Finney's sister Gwen, also adds a very strong emotional layer to the story with her fearless determination to find her brother, helped by her strange dreams that give clues about his location. So if you are a fan of supernatural thrillers, intense psychological horror, or movies that mix suspense with an emotional storyline, then The Black Phone, 2022, is a must-watch for you. It combines the horror of real-world crimes like child abduction with the mysterious supernatural help from beyond, creating a very unique and memorable experience. Watch this video till the end as we unfold all the details, from the technical aspects to the budget and box office results, and give you a clear understanding of what makes this movie stand out in the world of modern horror cinema. The Black Phone, 2022, takes place in a quiet suburban town in Colorado during the late 1970s, a time when children played outside without much fear, yet the shadow of something sinister lurked in the background. The story revolves around a shy and timid 13-year-old boy named Finney Blake, played by Mason Thames, who is trying to navigate a difficult childhood. He faces bullying at school and lives with his alcoholic and abusive father, which makes his world feel even more unsafe. His only true support is his younger sister Gwen, played by Madeline McGraw, who is tough, brave, and surprisingly mature for her age. She also has mysterious psychic dreams, an ability that she seems to have inherited from their late mother. In the town, several children have gone missing over the past months, and the locals whisper about a mysterious child abductor known only as the Grabber, portrayed chillingly by Ethan Hawke. The The grabber is a masked man who lures kids into his black van using black balloons as a distraction. His victims are never seen again, and fear slowly spreads through the neighborhood as police struggle to find any trace of him. Despite the warnings and increasing disappearances, Finney tries to keep his life normal, sticking to his routine of playing baseball and walking home with his sister. One day, Finney encounters the grabber in the most unexpected way. After a baseball game, he sees a man in a black van pretending to drop some groceries. Thinking he is harmless, Finney stops to help, but before he realizes it, the man abducts him. When Finney wakes up, he finds himself trapped in a soundproof basement with only a dirty mattress, a small window far above reach, and an old disconnected black rotary phone hanging on the wall. The grabber, wearing a disturbing mask with a permanent smile, visits him occasionally, speaking in a calm but menacing tone, hinting that Finney's time is limited. Strangely, the black phone begins to ring even though it has no working connection. At first, Finney thinks he is imagining things, but when he answers, he hears the voices of the previous victims of the grabber. These ghostly children give him advice, clues, and emotional strength to survive. Each call provides a different piece of the puzzle, from digging a tunnel to using a cord, to finding a weak spot in the room. These calls are not just instructions but also emotional messages from kids who suffered before him, now determined to help him escape the fate they could not. Meanwhile, Gwen has disturbing dreams showing glimpses of the basement and the grabber's house. She tries to convince the police that her dreams are real clues, but they initially dismiss her. Still, her determination leads her to keep searching, riding her bike through the neighborhood, hoping her visions will guide her to Finney before it's too late. As the story progresses, the grabber reveals his twisted nature. He plays mind games with Finney, pretending to be friendly at times and threatening at others. The basement becomes a place of psychological torture as much as physical imprisonment. But Finney, though scared, starts using every bit of advice from the ghostly calls to plan his escape. He digs a hole, hides a cable, sharpens his courage, and prepares for a final confrontation. In the climax, Finney sets a clever trap using the phone cord and the hole he dug. When the grabber finally comes in, expecting an easy kill, Finney fights back fiercely. He uses the phone itself as a weapon, wrapping the cord around the grabber's neck and killing him in a brutal but satisfying moment of survival. The spirits of the dead children seem to find peace after this, their voices fading as Finney emerges from the basement into the daylight. Gwen arrives with the police just in time to rescue him, and the siblings reunite in a touching moment of relief and victory. Finney, once a scared and timid boy, walks back to school with newfound strength and respect from his classmates. The black phone, once a symbol of terror, becomes a silent witness to his transformation from victim to survivor. The Black Phone, 2022, begins with a tone of uneasy normalcy set in a small Colorado town during the late 1970s, a period when kids played freely outdoors yet the sense of safety was slowly unraveling. The opening scenes follow Finney Blake, a shy and often bullied 13-year-old boy, and his younger sister Gwen, who is braver, outspoken, and protective of him. Their home life is far from stable, with an alcoholic and abusive father who struggles to care for them after the death of their mother. The early sequences establish their relationship dynamics, their vulnerability, and the wider tension in the neighborhood caused by a series of child abductions attributed to an unidentified man called the grabber. The inciting incident arrives when Finney, after a baseball game, encounters the grabber disguised as a friendly magician who drops his groceries on the street. What appears to be an accidental meeting quickly turns sinister as the man uses black balloons and a van to abduct him. This moment marks the point where the narrative transitions from everyday fear to a confined, psychological nightmare. Finney awakens in a soundproof basement with a dirty mattress, a high window, and a disconnected black rotary phone mounted on the wall. From here, the story starts to blend the tangible with the supernatural. The rising action unfolds through a series of eerie phone calls that come from the supposedly dead line. Each ring connects Finney with the voices of the grabber's previous victims, who offer him fragmented guidance on how to survive and escape. The narrative structure uses these calls as a way to reveal both backstory and survival strategies without resorting to traditional exposition. Each ghostly conversation provides a new layer, a loose tile to dig a tunnel, a hidden cord to use as a weapon, or advice on the grabber's twisted behavior patterns. This choice of unfolding the plot through spectral allies allows the film to maintain suspense while feeding the protagonist, and the audience, just enough information to stay hopeful. Parallel to Finney's entrapment, the film follows Gwen's journey as she experiences vivid psychic dreams that offer cryptic glimpses of her brother's location and the grabber's lair. Her subplot functions as an external thread of investigation while the main story remains confined in the basement. This dual narrative creates tension, the race against time outside and the step-by-step struggle for survival inside. The midpoint of the film arrives when Finney begins to shed his initial fear and take active steps to prepare for escape. He digs a hole, practices using the phone cord, and sets small traps, each influenced by the spectral children's advice. The grabber, meanwhile, is shown as a disturbing blend of menace and unpredictability, wearing a mask with interchangeable expressions and playing sadistic games of waiting for his victim to misbehave. As the story pushes toward its climax, the editing quickens and the stakes rise. Gwen's visions become clearer, and the police start to take her information seriously. Finney, now more determined, realizes that the phone is not just a lifeline but a weapon. The ghosts rally behind him in a final call, giving him courage and a plan. This moment represents the turning point where the victim takes control of his fate. The final act delivers a tense confrontation. The grabber enters the basement expecting to overpower Finney, but the boy uses the environment and the phone cord to trap him, breaking his ankle in a pitfall and strangling him with the cord. This brutal act is not just survival. It is the culmination of Finney's transformation from a passive, frightened boy to an empowered survivor. The ghosts watch in silence as justice is delivered, their presence finally fading. The narrative resolves with Gwen leading the police to the house, rescuing Finney, and reuniting the siblings. The film closes on a note of quiet triumph. Finney walks back into school, no longer the timid boy everyone overlooked but someone who has faced death and found strength in the process. The plot's linear structure, punctuated by supernatural calls and dream visions, balances psychological horror with a coming-of-age arc. Its choice to gradually reveal the villain's lair, the victim's stories, and the protagonist's ingenuity creates a rhythm that keeps viewers engaged without overwhelming them with constant action. The Black Phone uses its narrative to explore survival, resilience, and the invisible bonds between the living and the dead. Each turning point is marked not by grand spectacle but by small victories: a dug hole, a hidden weapon, a whisper from a lost child. These beats build toward a finale that is both cathartic and unsettling, leaving just enough unanswered questions about the supernatural phone to keep the story lingering after the credits. The Black Phone, 2022, is driven not only by its eerie atmosphere and suspenseful plot but also by the development of its central characters, who evolve in meaningful ways as the story unfolds. At the heart of the film is Finney Blake, a 13-year-old boy portrayed by Mason Thames. When the story begins, Finney is quiet, timid, and often bullied at school. He has little confidence in himself, avoids conflict, and relies heavily on his younger sister Gwen for support. Their bond is clear early on. Gwen, played by Madeline McGraw, is bold, sharp-tongued, and unafraid to confront those who cross her brother. Their relationship serves as the emotional backbone of the film and grounds the supernatural horror in a deeply human connection. Finney's arc is one of the most significant elements of the film's narrative. He begins as a passive character who endures abuse at school and fear at home, particularly from his alcoholic father Terence, portrayed by Jeremy Davies. This lack of agency defines his early presence. However, his kidnapping by the grabber, played by Ethan Hawke, forces him into a life-or-death situation where passivity is no longer an option. Trapped in the basement, Finney undergoes a gradual transformation. The phone calls from the spirits of the grabber's past victims act as a series of lessons, each pushing him closer to action and self-reliance. By the end of the film, Finney is no longer the boy who avoids conflict. He has learned to strategize, to fight, and ultimately to kill when his survival depends on it. This shift is not sudden but earned through a series of trials and failed attempts that build his resilience. Gwen, while not physically trapped like her brother, experiences her own form of character evolution. Gifted with psychic dreams reminiscent of their late mother's abilities, she starts as a child struggling to be heard by adults. Her visions of the grabber's crimes are dismissed at first, but her persistence and courage in following them become crucial to finding Finney. Her arc demonstrates strength in a different form. Where Finney learns to fight, Gwen learns to channel her intuition and confront both the supernatural and the skepticism of authority figures. Her defiance of their abusive father also hints at a cycle of inherited trauma being broken, as she refuses to let fear silence her. The antagonist, the grabber, is less about change and more about revelation. Played with chilling unpredictability by Ethan Hawke, he is introduced as a mysterious predator whose motives are only hinted at. His use of masks with shifting expressions suggests a fractured identity, but the film never fully explains his pathology, leaving him as an embodiment of sadistic power rather than a fully fleshed-out human being. This lack of evolution is intentional. The grabber exists as a static force of terror, making Finney's growth more pronounced. Supporting characters, while fewer in number, play distinct roles in shaping the arcs of the leads. Terence Blake, the father, initially appears as a one-dimensional abusive parent, but glimpses of his grief and fear for his children offer slight complexity, hinting at a man broken by loss and addiction. Robin, Finney's brave school friend who becomes one of the grabber's victims, lingers in the narrative through his ghostly guidance. His earlier mentorship, teaching Finney to stand up to bullies, carries into the afterlife, where he delivers a crucial pep talk that cements Finney's resolve. The spectral children themselves each contribute fragments of courage and tactical advice, collectively representing the voices of those lost but not forgotten. One of the more subtle character dynamics lies in the relationship between Finney and the phone itself. At first, he treats it as a symbol of his entrapment, a useless relic in a basement of despair. As the story progresses, it becomes a source of hope, then a weapon, and finally a tool of justice. This symbolic evolution parallels Finney's own journey from helplessness to empowerment, showing that even inanimate elements can participate in character development when used thoughtfully. By the film's end, the core characters have either been transformed or revealed. Finney walks back into school no longer the shy boy he once was, carrying the quiet strength of survival. Gwen stands beside him, their bond stronger for the ordeal they endured. Their father, while not fully redeemed, shows signs of remorse, suggesting the possibility of a less violent household going forward. The ghosts, having aided Finney, fade away, their unfinished business resolved. The grabber, the one character who does not change, meets a fitting end, trapped by his own cruelty. The Black Phone uses its character development to reinforce its themes of resilience, trauma, and the passage from childhood vulnerability to hard-won maturity. Small gestures, Finney tightening his grip on the phone, Gwen riding her bike determinately through the rain, Robin's ghost encouraging a final stand, accumulate into an emotional arc that makes the film more than a simple horror story. It is a coming-of-age tale wrapped in the skin of a thriller, where survival is not only about escaping a basement but about finding one's voice against the forces that silence it. The Black Phone, 2022, gains much of its haunting power not only from its story and atmosphere but from the strength of its performances, which give the horror emotional weight and make its supernatural elements feel grounded. The cast, though not extensive, delivers performances that balance vulnerability, menace, and emotional truth, creating a film that lingers long after its final scene. At the center is Mason Thames as Finney Blake, a boy forced to grow from timidity to resilience under the most harrowing of circumstances. Thames carries much of the film's emotional load, and his performance is a revelation for a young actor in a genre that often leans on spectacle over subtlety. Early scenes show him as withdrawn, hesitant, and almost fading into the background of his own life. The way he lowers his gaze, stumbles over his words, and flinches in the presence of bullies or his father builds a portrait of a boy used to surviving quietly. As the story unfolds, Thames slowly shifts this energy. His voice gains firmness, his eyes hold longer on the villain, and his physical stance becomes more assertive. By the time he executes his plan to escape, the transformation is entirely believable because it has been layered moment by moment rather than forced in a single dramatic turn. Madeline McGraw as Gwen Blake is another standout, delivering a fiery, heartfelt performance that injects both humor and emotional bite into the narrative. Gwen is sharp-tongued, fearless, and deeply loyal to her brother, and McGraw captures this with a natural charisma that never feels overacted. Her scenes of defiance, whether preying in raw frustration or challenging their father's abuse, provide the film with moments of grounded humanity. McGraw also handles the film's lighter touches with ease, letting Gwen's wit cut through the darkness without breaking its tension. Ethan Hawke as the grabber offers one of the most chilling portrayals in recent horror cinema. Hawke, known for his versatile range, disappears behind a mask that changes expressions, from a wicked smile to a gaping mouth of rage, and still manages to convey layers of menace through his eyes, posture, and voice. He avoids the trap of playing the villain as purely monstrous. Instead, his pauses, sudden shifts in tone, and unsettling calm create a predator who is unpredictable, almost childlike in his games, and far more frightening for it. His performance relies on controlled restraint rather than constant outbursts, making his rare explosions of violence feel even more dangerous. Jeremy Davies as Terence Blake, the sibling's father, gives a raw and uncomfortable performance. He plays a man consumed by grief and alcohol, whose cruelty often masks his own weakness. Davy's nervous energy and jittery movements make the character both threatening and pitiful, a figure of domestic horror in his own right. While his arc is less prominent than the main story, his portrayal adds texture to the world Finney and Gwen inhabit and helps explain their hardened survival instincts. Supporting performances from the young actors playing the grabber's previous victims are brief but impactful. Each ghostly child brings a different tone to their spectral guidance. Some bitter, some resigned, some fiercely protective. These performances, though often limited to short, eerie conversations, add layers of tragedy to the story. Brady Hepner as Vance, Tristan Provong as Bruce, and Jacob Moran as Billy each leave an impression despite their limited screen time. Their dialogue is delivered with the quiet sadness of children robbed of their futures, turning them into more than mere plot devices. Roger Mitchell and Troy Rude Seal as the local detectives provide a grounded, procedural counterpoint to the supernatural elements. Their roles are functional rather than flashy, but they keep the external thread of the investigation moving believably without overstepping the focus on the children's ordeal. What makes the performances in The Black Phone resonate is the balance of stillness and eruption. The film often lingers on faces in close-up, a tear sliding down Finney's cheek as he grips the disconnected phone, Gwen's defiant stare after a beating, the grabber sitting silently in a chair waiting for his victim to descend into fear. These quiet moments are where the acting shines, allowing micro-expressions and subtle shifts in body language to tell the story as effectively as dialogue. The chemistry between Mason Thames and Madeline McGraw deserves particular praise. Their sibling dynamic feels lived in, full of small jabs, shared secrets, and an unspoken loyalty that makes the stakes of the kidnapping personal rather than abstract. Their scenes together, especially in the opening act and the reunion at the end, anchor the film's emotional arc. Hawke's performance, though heavily masked, also shows how a skilled actor can turn limitation into strength. He uses the mask as a psychological weapon, tilting his head to exaggerate its grin or letting his voice dip into a sing-song cadence that hints at deranged playfulness. Even in silence, his physicality creates unease. The way he slouches in a chair or stands just out of the light makes every basement scene feel like a predator toying with prey. Overall, the cast of The Black Phone, 2022, commits to a style of acting that serves both the horror and the coming-of-age story at its heart. There are no wasted roles or jarring performances that pull viewers out of the experience. Instead, each actor contributes to a shared atmosphere of dread, resilience, and grim hope. Their collective work elevates the film from a simple tale of captivity to a memorable character-driven thriller where every glance, whisper, and scream feels earned. The Black Phone, 2022, is a film that stands out as much for its unsettling tone as for its intimate storytelling, and this is largely due to the directorial vision of Scott Derrickson. Known for his work in the horror genre with films like Sinister and Deliver Us from Evil, Derrickson approaches this adaptation of Joe Hill's short story with a deliberate focus on atmosphere, pacing, and character-driven tension rather than over-reliance on jump scares. His direction steers the film toward a blend of psychological horror and coming-of-age drama, creating a layered experience that resonates beyond the typical boundaries of its genre. From the opening scenes, Derrickson sets a tone that is both nostalgic and foreboding. The 1970s small-town setting is rendered with a warm yet slightly faded palette, evoking an era of freedom and innocence undercut by the creeping dread of child disappearances. This choice establishes a visual and emotional contrast between the world outside and the claustrophobic basement where most of the story unfolds. Derrickson's direction ensures that even moments of childhood joy, baseball games, bike rides, schoolyard chatter, carry a shadow, preparing the audience for the darker narrative turn. A hallmark of Derrickson's style in this film is his restraint. He avoids over-explaining the supernatural elements and instead allows the Black Phone itself to remain a mysterious object whose rules and origins are only partially revealed. This choice heightens the tension, as both Finney and the audience learn its significance through fragmented, ghostly calls. Rather than flooding the viewer with exposition, Derrickson relies on suggestion, eerie silence, and the performances of the young actors to make the supernatural believable. The way Derrickson directs his actors, particularly the children, demonstrates his commitment to authentic emotional stakes. Mason Thames as Finney is guided through a subtle arc of fear to empowerment, and the director allows space for quiet moments where this transformation can breathe. Scenes are not rushed to reach their climactic beats. Instead, pauses, hesitations, and lingering close-ups capture the internal battles of the characters. Madeline McGraw as Gwen benefits similarly, with Derrickson encouraging her to play both fierce defiance and vulnerable grief without slipping into caricature. Derrickson's handling of Ethan Hawke as the grabber is another notable element of his direction. By keeping the villain partially obscured, sometimes masked, often in shadow, he maintains a sense of the unknown that is more unsettling than explicit violence. The decision to reveal the grabber's habits and rituals slowly, often from a distance or through the perspective of the trapped boy, makes his menace feel omnipresent without resorting to constant confrontation. Hawke's unpredictable movements and eerie stillness are amplified by Derrickson's framing, which often positions him at the edge of the scene, waiting. Pacing, a crucial element in any thriller, is carefully managed under Derrickson's direction. The film begins with a slow, observational rhythm that lets viewers settle into the town's routine before the abduction. Once Finney is taken, the tempo shifts, alternating between tense waiting and bursts of frantic action. Derrickson resists the temptation to turn every moment into a scare, instead building a rhythm where quiet dread becomes as important as overt horror. This is especially clear in the way he uses the phone calls. Each one is a moment of revelation but also a pause, a breath before the next attempt to escape. Stylistically, Derrickson favors a mixture of traditional horror framing, dimly lit hallways, close-ups on anxious faces, and more grounded, almost documentary-like shots of the town and its inhabitants. This balance keeps the story tethered to reality even as ghosts intervene. His use of negative space, where the audience scans the edges of the frame for movement or threat, adds to the unease without relying on cheap tricks. When moments of violence or supernatural intensity do arrive, they feel earned because the film has not numbed the viewer with constant noise. One of Derrickson's strongest directorial choices is his respect for silence and stillness. Scenes in the basement often stretch into quiet standoffs between Finney and his captor, the tension amplified by what is not said. Even the phone's ring, sharp, intrusive, gains power because it cuts through that stillness. This contrasts with many modern horror films that rely heavily on relentless soundscapes to keep viewers on edge. Here, Derrickson uses absence as effectively as presence. The emotional through line of the film, siblings bound by trauma, ghosts reaching out to prevent further suffering, is handled with sensitivity. Derrickson does not sensationalize their pain, but lets it inform the narrative organically. The final reunion between Finney and Gwen is directed with understated relief rather than melodrama, allowing the weight of the ordeal to linger without forcing a cathartic outpouring. In summary, Scott Derrickson's direction in The Black Phone, 2022, is defined by measured restraint, attention to character, and an ability to craft horror that feels intimate rather than distant. His choices in pacing, framing, and performance guidance result in a film where fear grows naturally from the situation and the people within it, not just from its supernatural premise. The result is a story that is tense yet human, frightening yet rooted in the kind of emotional truth that makes its scares resonate long after the lights come up. The cinematography of The Black Phone 2022, led by Brett Jukiewicz, is essential to how the film shapes mood and meaning, using color, framing and camera movement to make the ordinary feel dangerous and the small feel vast. The palette is intentionally muted and period-aware, favoring faded ambers, dusty greens and desaturated blues that suggest a late 1970s suburb viewed through the haze of memory. Against that washed-out background, sudden elements such as the black rotary phone and the dark van read as graphic intrusions, their weight amplified by careful placement in frame and by restrained color grading choices. Framing drives much of the film's emotional grammar. Wide shots of the neighborhood create a false sense of safety and vulnerability, while interior compositions tighten progressively as the story moves toward confinement. The basement sequences are predominantly shot with close framing and shallow depth of field so that surfaces, small gestures and micro-expressions register as the primary narrative signals. The phone itself is often centered or given a slow push-in, elevating it from prop to symbol and allowing the camera to insist on its presence whenever silence threatens to flatten the scene. Negative space is used to haunting effect, keeping the grabber partly in shadow or at the edge of frame so that menace is implied rather than spelled out. That visual withholding makes the occasional reveal more potent because the audience has been conditioned to look into darkness for threat. Lighting supports this dynamic with a clear contrast between sunlit, almost nostalgic exteriors and the cold, practical fixtures of the basement. Natural light in outdoor sequences is slightly overexposed at times to create a faded memory-like quality, while the basement is defined by hard top lighting, sparse practical bulbs and pools of shadow that render the room a maze of textures rather than a single arena. Gwen's vision sequences receive a distinct treatment, often presented in cooler tones, softer focus and a mild filmic bloom that signals a shift in reality without tacking on heavy effects. These sequences feel dreamlike but remain visually tied to the main palette so the transitions do not jar. Movement choices are measured and deliberate. Long steady takes and slow tracking shots allow dread to accumulate in silence, while occasional handheld bursts and tighter arcs are deployed for panic and discovery, creating a rhythm that mirrors the protagonist's psychological state. The camera's pacing evolves with the character, observant and patient early on, then more urgent and precise as Finney gains agency. Rack focus is used as a storytelling tool, guiding attention from small details to faces and back again, and occasional push-ins give moments of interior revelation more cinematic weight. Lens selection enhances texture, with wider lenses in exterior sequences emphasizing exposure and openness and medium to long lenses indoors compressing space and intensifying intimacy. The cinematography favors slightly off-center compositions that feel observational and lived in, which makes moments of strict symmetry or formal composition arresting because they interrupt the established visual logic. Practical camera work paired with an appreciation for negative space turns simple objects and gestures into narrative pivots. Sound and image interplay is also factored into the shooting approach. Long visual beats allow the sound design room to breathe, and the cinematography reciprocates by holding the frame so that the phone's ring or a footstep becomes an event. There are a number of standout images that linger: the slow push toward the ringing black phone in a near-silent room, the tableau of children halted as a van approaches, the barred basement window framed like a distant promise, and the composition of the final trap sequence where camera placement makes the audience complicit in the reveal. These moments work because they are staged and lit to perform narrative duty rather than to show off technique. Overall, the camera work in the Black Phone 2022 is interpretive rather than decorative, translating themes into light, depth, and movement. By anchoring the supernatural in tactile, lived-in cinematography, the film makes its small world feel dangerously alive and visually memorable. The result is a visual language that stays with the viewer long after the credits roll and invites repeated viewing. The editing and pacing of the Black Phone 2022 form a critical backbone for its suspense-driven narrative, creating an atmosphere that is at once unnerving and deliberate. Under the careful work of editor Frederick Thorevel, the film finds a rhythm that mirrors the experience of its protagonist Finney, swinging between moments of stillness that stretch like an endless night and bursts of movement that arrive like sudden jolts of fear. From the opening, the editing adopts a measured pace, taking time to establish the 1970s suburban environment and the quiet unease that runs beneath it. Scenes of baseball games, school hallways, and sibling interactions are given enough space to feel real, almost mundane, before the creeping threat of the grabber begins to close in. These early cuts are smooth and unhurried, often transitioning through natural sounds or soft fades that make the first act feel like a slow tightening of a noose rather than an abrupt trap. Once Finney is taken, the editing shifts in character. The basement sequences form the heart of the film's tension, and their rhythm is crafted through a balance of silence and interruption. The choice to hold shots longer than expected lets the viewer sit with the boy's fear. The camera lingers on walls, a still phone, a locked door, and then cuts are used to puncture that stillness when something happens. The phone rings, a door creaks open, or the grabber descends the stairs. This alternation between stasis and sudden activity is central to how the film builds dread. Rather than relying on a barrage of quick cuts, the editing trusts negative space and long pauses, making each interruption feel louder and more threatening. Montage is used sparingly but effectively, particularly during sequences where Finney begins to piece together escape strategies. Short clusters of shots show him digging, testing the phone cord, or planning routes without ever turning into a glossy training sequence. These bursts propel momentum in the second act and prevent the film from becoming visually stagnant. The pacing here is tight enough to suggest the passage of time, but not so hurried that it undermines the oppressive weight of his captivity. Each cut serves as a marker of effort, struggle, and preparation. Flashbacks and dreamlike visions are handled with careful transitions, especially in the sequences involving Gwen. Her visions are integrated with soft edges and slightly altered pacing so that they feel like part of the same narrative world, but with a subtle otherworldly rhythm. The editing uses these moments as narrative relief valves, cutting away from the dark basement to a different kind of tension, and then returns, often with a sound bridge, to keep the threads connected. Cross-cutting between Gwen's search and Finney's survival creates a pulse of dramatic irony. The audience knows rescue is inching closer, but the boy remains unaware, and the editing exploits that gap for suspense. As the film moves into its final act, the pacing accelerates noticeably. The cuts become sharper and more frequent during the climactic confrontation with the grabber. The trap's preparation, the final ring of the black phone, and the ghostly vengeance delivered through it are cut with a rising urgency, mirroring Finney's transformation from a frightened child into a boy who has seized control of his fate. Yet even here, the editor avoids chaos. Each moment is legible, each reaction given enough screen time to land emotionally. There are beats where the cut holds for a fraction longer than expected. A stare, a breath, a moment of hesitation, and those small delays are what make the release of tension feel earned rather than rushed. There are portions in the middle section where some viewers might feel the pacing risks slowing too much, especially during the repeated waiting periods in the basement. A slightly tighter trim here might have intensified the rhythm, but this deliberate drag is also reflective of Finney's own distorted sense of time. The editing invites the audience to feel the endlessness of captivity, the way minutes blur into hours when fear is constant. One of the film's greatest editorial strengths is its restraint. It does not fear silence. It does not cut away from stillness out of impatience. Instead, it uses that stillness as a canvas upon which each sound, each movement, each ring of the phone becomes an event. This approach is rare in modern horror, where over-editing often smothers suspense. Here, by allowing moments to breathe, the fear has room to grow. The result is a flow that starts slow, tightens like a noose, then snaps violently at just the right moment, ensuring the emotional highs and lows feel organic. The editing makes the supernatural believable, the mundane menacing, and the ending cathartic, proving that in a film where a phone may or may not be haunted, the true ghost is the rhythm of time itself. The soundtrack and score of The Black Phone 2022, composed by Mark Corvin, are integral to the film's ability to create an atmosphere that is both haunting and grounded in its 1970s setting. The music does not overwhelm the narrative but acts as a psychological undercurrent, subtly guiding the audience through fear, hope, and despair. From the opening scene, the film establishes a sound world that is textured, eerie, and intentionally restrained. Rather than using constant music, Corvin allows silence to become a weapon, letting the absence of sound be as unnerving as the score itself. This interplay between quiet and noise becomes a recurring motif that shapes the viewing experience. The use of licensed tracks from the era provides an authentic backdrop that situates the viewer in a specific time and place. These selections are not overused or forced but appear in moments that feel natural to the world of the children. Radios playing, kids riding bikes, or background music at school events. When these songs appear, they create a sense of nostalgia that makes the later descent into terror even more jarring. The brightness of a familiar tune is often followed by a chilling silence, and this contrast is what gives the film its emotional punch. The original score leans heavily on low drones, dissonant strings, and subtle percussive textures that creep rather than crash. Corvin employs minimalistic motifs that attach themselves to key elements of the story, particularly the black phone itself. Every time the phone rings or becomes the focus of Finney's attention, the music introduces faint, distorted tonal swells that make the object feel alive and ominous. This thematic scoring allows the phone to carry an auditory signature throughout the film, so that even in moments when it is not on screen, the audience senses its looming presence. Silence plays a crucial role in building tension. In the basement sequences, there are long stretches where no score plays at all, only the faint hum of the space or distant ambient noise. When the score does enter, it often does so with a single low note, a sustained vibration that unsettles without announcing itself. This patience with sound is what allows the scares to land harder. Rather than relying on loud stingers or sudden musical crashes, the film uses sound to stretch anticipation, to make viewers lean in rather than flinch prematurely. Gwen's vision sequences receive a slightly altered musical treatment, with the score becoming more ethereal and layered, incorporating whisper-like textures and reverb that signal a step into the supernatural. These moments are among the few where the music takes a front-facing role, helping the audience separate psychic visions from the oppressive reality of the basement. The shift is subtle but meaningful, ensuring the transitions feel organic rather than jarring. One of the most memorable uses of music comes in the final act. As Finney sets his trap and the phone rings for the last time, the score swells into a tense, almost triumphant rhythm that mirrors his shift from prey to predator. The low tones rise slightly, percussion enters in a muted heartbeat-like pulse, and the ringing phone slices through the mix as if signaling justice is at hand. This layering builds emotional momentum without tipping into melodrama. There are moments where the score intentionally withholds itself, particularly during scenes of dialogue between Finney and the ghostly voices. Here, the absence of music allows the words and the static-laced sound of the phone to dominate, creating an intimate and eerie auditory space. This choice respects the weight of those interactions, letting them feel personal and chilling rather than theatrically orchestrated. The final moments of the film use music sparingly, opting for a subdued close rather than a grand, sweeping cue. This restraint ensures that the emotional resolution belongs to the characters rather than to a piece of music. It leaves the viewer with an echo rather than a chorus, reinforcing the lingering unease that the story is meant to carry beyond the credits. Overall, the soundtrack and score of The Black Phone 2022 are not flashy but are deeply effective. They serve the story rather than compete with it, enhancing its mood without dictating it. Corvin's minimalist, textured approach makes the supernatural elements feel organic and the moments of terror more impactful. By blending period-accurate licensed tracks, haunting original themes, and deliberate stretches of silence, the film crafts an auditory experience that is as memorable as its imagery, proving that sometimes what you do not hear is as frightening as what you do. Beneath its surface as a tense supernatural thriller, The Black Phone 2022 carries several layered themes and messages that give weight to its narrative beyond the scares. At its heart, the film is about survival, resilience, and the power of inner strength when faced with overwhelming fear. The story follows Finney, a boy thrust into captivity, and examines how isolation, trauma, and the haunting presence of those who came before him shape his transformation from a frightened child into a resourceful survivor. This journey reflects a universal theme of confronting one's fears and finding courage not as a sudden gift but as something forged through suffering and persistence. One of the central thematic elements is the exploration of childhood vulnerability in a predatory world. The film is set in the late 1970s, a time portrayed with a veneer of small-town safety that masks lurking dangers. The grabber embodies the threat that adults can pose when societal structures fail to protect children. This is not only about physical abduction but also about the broader theme of how innocence is preyed upon and how children must often find their own ways to fight back. The phone, in this context, becomes both a literal and symbolic lifeline, connecting Finney to a past of lost lives and turning their trauma into tools for his survival. Sibling bonds and the theme of connection run strongly through the story. Gwen's role as a sister who refuses to give up on Finney reflects the message that even in the face of evil, the ties of love can become a form of resistance. Her psychic visions are framed less as a supernatural gift and more as an emotional tether, an unspoken reminder that connection has power even across unseen distances. This ties into a recurring idea in the film, the past speaking to the present. The dead boy's voices on the phone are more than ghosts, they are memories and warnings turned into action, a narrative device that suggests trauma does not disappear but can, when confronted, help prevent further harm. Another underlying theme is the confrontation with helplessness. For much of the film, Finney is portrayed as quiet, cautious, and hesitant to act. The narrative shows his gradual movement from paralysis to empowerment, illustrating a message that strength is often born in the darkest moments. The advice and instructions given by the voices symbolize the cumulative knowledge of those who did not survive, creating a message about how shared pain can still contribute to eventual victory, even if indirectly. Fear itself is explored not just as a sensation but as a weapon. The grabber thrives on inducing fear, waiting for his victims to try to escape so he can punish them, feeding on their terror like a ritual. The film examines how fear can be paralyzing but also how it can sharpen instincts when controlled. Finney's eventual success comes not from eliminating his fear but from channeling it into action. Themes of justice and retribution also ripple through the story. The phone allows the dead to enact a form of vengeance, turning the hunter into the hunted. This is not portrayed as grand or moralistic justice but rather as a raw, cathartic balancing of scales. It asks the question, when the system cannot deliver justice, is supernatural intervention the only way some wrongs are righted? There is also a quiet commentary on belief, whether in the form of Gwen's visions, the parents' dismissiveness, or the boy's initial doubt about the phone. The film suggests that belief, even if imperfect or ridiculed, can open the door to survival. The narrative does not force an overt moral lesson but leaves space for interpretation. Belief may not always be logical, but hope often needs something irrational to hold on to. Power dynamics run through nearly every interaction. The grabber exerts control through manipulation, silence, and staged opportunities for punishment, while Finney gradually reclaims power by refusing to play the role assigned to him. This dynamic mirrors broader ideas of oppression and resistance. When a stronger force dominates, survival may depend not on brute strength but on patience, cunning, and seizing the right moment. By the end, the message of The Black Phone is not one of perfect restoration but of survival marked by scars. Finney does not emerge unchanged. He emerges wiser, harder, and more aware of the fragility of safety. The film closes with a sense that trauma lingers but does not have to define the future, a theme that resonates far beyond its horror trappings. It is a story about listening to the past, trusting the bonds that remain, and finding strength in moments where fear seems absolute. The Black Phone, 2022, is not a film that relies heavily on visual effects or CGI in the traditional blockbuster sense, but it does utilize them in subtle and purposeful ways to enhance the eerie and supernatural undertones of its story. The film primarily operates within the horror and thriller genre with a grounded setting, but it has certain supernatural elements tied to the titular Black Phone and the ghostly appearances of past victims. These moments are where visual effects come into play, often seamlessly blended with practical effects to maintain the gritty, realistic tone of the movie. Rather than overwhelming the viewer with flashy or noticeable digital work, the filmmakers opted for a restrained approach where the effects serve the story rather than distract from it. For example, the appearances of the ghostly children are not loud or overdone with excessive CGI. Instead, they feel tangible, almost like faded memories intruding upon the real world, thanks to a mix of subtle visual layering, lighting tricks, and careful compositing. The transparency of these figures, the way they fade in or out of the frame, and their slightly distorted yet believable presence are handled with restraint, showing how minimal but well-placed VFX can create a lingering unease. The Black Phone itself, as an object, does not display heavy digital manipulation, but its ringing and the supernatural connection it forms with the protagonist rely on subtle sound and visual cues enhanced through post-production effects. The moments when the phone comes alive, vibrating with otherworldly energy or revealing cracks between the living and the dead, are where CGI quietly enters the frame without making itself the focal point. There are scenes where the line between the real world and the spectral communication blurs, and this is achieved through techniques like compositing layered shadows or creating faint distortions in the environment around the phone. Such choices give the sense that something beyond the physical realm is intruding without breaking the grounded visual style of the film. Practical effects play a major role in keeping the horror authentic, especially in scenes involving physical tension or violence. Where many horror films might lean on digital blood or over-the-top enhancements, the Black Phone keeps things gritty with mostly practical gore and bruising, complemented lightly by VFX to smoothen transitions or enhance the mood. The restrained use of visual effects makes the story more immersive because the viewer is never pulled out by something that looks obviously artificial. Instead, the effects act as invisible threads tying the supernatural layer of the narrative to the otherwise bleak and realistic depiction of a child abduction thriller. The film does not indulge in large-scale CGI sequences, explosions, or grand illusions, which works to its advantage. The few moments that might have required heavier compositing, such as the shifting spaces where the protagonist interacts with ghostly guidance or visions, are handled with a muted palette and soft edges so they feel like extensions of the nightmare-like reality he inhabits. These moments are designed to unsettle rather than impress with technical showmanship. This is a conscious decision that respects the tone of the film, keeping the focus on atmosphere, dread, and emotional impact instead of spectacle. If there is any criticism to be made of the visual effects, it might be that their subtlety sometimes borders on invisibility, making some supernatural interactions feel less striking or memorable than they could have been. For viewers expecting overt horror imagery, the restrained CGI may feel too quiet or understated. However, for a story like The Black Phone, this quietness becomes its strength, making the ghostly elements feel like whispered warnings rather than dramatic apparitions. The blend of practical and digital techniques ensures that the horror is always in service of the narrative, supporting the protagonist's psychological struggle and the film's creeping sense of dread. In summary, the visual effects and CGI in The Black Phone, 2022, are a study in restraint. They are never flashy, rarely noticeable at first glance, and almost always working behind the scenes to make the supernatural elements feel organic to the film's dark, claustrophobic world. This approach allows the emotional weight of the story and the performances to remain at the forefront, proving that in a genre often dominated by excess, sometimes the most effective effects are the ones you barely notice. The set design and locations in The Black Phone, 2022, play a crucial role in building the oppressive, unsettling world that the story inhabits. Rather than relying on grand or elaborate settings, the film makes deliberate use of intimate, confined spaces to heighten tension and immerse the audience in the protagonist's terrifying ordeal. One of the most significant locations is the basement where much of the action unfolds. The basement is stark, grim, and hauntingly empty, yet every small detail contributes to its chilling authenticity. The peeling walls, sparse furniture, and harsh lighting evoke a sense of abandonment and isolation, making the space feel like a character in itself. It reflects the kidnapper's cold and calculated personality while also becoming a prison that mirrors the protagonist's fear and desperation. The production team's choice to keep this set simple yet oppressive ensures that the viewer's focus stays on the characters' emotions and the story's suspense rather than being distracted by unnecessary visual clutter. The film also makes smart use of its neighborhood setting, depicting a 1970s suburban environment that feels both ordinary and ominous. The quiet streets, modest houses, and slightly worn-down appearances give a sense of a community where sinister things could hide in plain sight. These locations are carefully chosen to feel familiar yet uneasy, with the mundane serving as a backdrop to the extraordinary horror at the story's core. The school, the streets where the children disappear, and the homes of the characters are not overly stylized, but their authenticity adds to the believability of the narrative. By grounding the supernatural elements in such a real and recognizable world, the horror feels closer and more unsettling. Props and set dressing are also used effectively to imply history and character. The titular black phone is the most obvious example, a simple, outdated rotary phone that carries an eerie significance. Its worn look and outdated design immediately set it apart as an object from another time, adding to its mystique. Small details in the kidnapper's house, such as the sparse decorations and cold, functional furniture, tell us a great deal about his personality without any exposition. These choices make the environment feel lived in yet hollow, as though it exists only to serve his twisted purpose. The production design also pays attention to the contrast between spaces. The protagonist's home, while modest and at times chaotic due to family tensions, has warmth and texture that the basement lacks. This contrast helps emphasize the shift between safety and danger, freedom and captivity. The streets and public spaces have a sunlit normalcy that makes the moments of horror stand out even more starkly, showing how easily darkness can lurk within the everyday. Real locations appear to be used where possible, lending a sense of authenticity that a studio build might not fully capture. When studio sets are employed, they are crafted with attention to texture and imperfection. Scuffed floors, worn-out wallpaper, and dim lighting choices that make the world feel tangible. The film avoids glossy or overly polished design, instead embracing a slightly rough and aged look that fits its period setting and grim subject matter. Overall, the set design and location choices in The Black Phone, 2022, are understated yet highly effective. They do not overwhelm the story with elaborate visuals, but they create a world that feels real, textured, and ominous. Every space has a purpose, from the confining basement to the deceptively ordinary streets, and each helps the actors inhabit their roles with greater conviction. The production design serves the story's themes of entrapment, fear, and the hidden dangers within familiar surroundings, proving that sometimes the most effective horror environments are those that look like they could exist just down the street. The script of The Black Phone, 2022, demonstrates a deliberate and measured approach to dialogue, using it not only as a functional tool to move the plot but also as a means of revealing character, building tension, and enhancing the film's unsettling atmosphere. The writing avoids unnecessary exposition, choosing instead to let conversations unfold naturally within the confines of the story's world. This is evident in the way Finney and his sister Gwen interact early in the film. Their exchanges feel authentic, filled with the kind of banter and occasional sharpness that siblings often share. Through their dialogue, we quickly gain insight into their family dynamic, their mutual dependence, and the struggles they face at home, especially with their abusive father. These moments establish a foundation of empathy for the characters, making the audience more invested in their survival and growth. Throughout the film, much of the dialogue operates beneath the surface, carrying subtext that speaks louder than the words themselves. For example, when the grabber speaks to Finney, his words are often calm, even playful, but layered with menace and unpredictability. He never fully reveals his intentions, and the pauses between his sentences often create more dread than what is explicitly said. This restraint reflects the script's understanding that fear often comes from what is left unsaid. Rather than having the antagonist monologue his backstory or motivations, the film leaves gaps that the viewer fills with their own imagination, which is a hallmark of effective horror writing. Conversations between Finney and the ghostly voices on the Black Phone also serve a dual purpose. They deliver crucial information for his escape while revealing fragments of the victims' personalities and tragic fates. These exchanges are concise but loaded with emotion, as each voice has its own tone, some bitter, some resigned, others determined to help. The script ensures these moments do not become repetitive by varying the approach and content of each call, creating a sense of gradual discovery rather than exposition dumps. This structural decision keeps the pacing tight and the tension alive. One of the film's strengths is knowing when not to use dialogue. Silence is often employed to heighten fear, particularly in the basement scenes where Finney must remain quiet to avoid provoking the grabber. These moments of stillness create a contrast with the bursts of dialogue that do occur, making the spoken lines feel more impactful. For instance, a single whispered warning or a calm statement from the grabber can feel far more threatening after a stretch of quiet. That said, there are moments where the script leans slightly toward predictability, especially in some of the dialogue surrounding the final confrontation. Certain lines of defiance or triumph may feel familiar to seasoned horror viewers, echoing standard genre fare rather than breaking new ground. However, these moments are few and do not detract significantly from the overall effectiveness of the writing. The screenplay also uses dialogue to reflect the time period subtly. Set in the late 1970s, the language, slang, and conversational rhythms match the era without becoming heavy-handed. It feels lived in rather than performative, allowing the audience to immerse themselves in the setting without being constantly reminded of it. Overall, the script of The Black Phone, 2022, strikes a strong balance between tension-building restraint and narrative clarity. Its dialogue is rarely wasted, often serving multiple functions at once, developing character, hinting at backstory, and advancing the plot. The interplay between spoken lines and silence adds a layered quality to the storytelling, making even simple exchanges resonate with unease. A few moments of conventional phrasing aside, the script's voice feels authentic and appropriately chilling, proving that in horror, sometimes less truly is more. The Black Phone, 2022, firmly positions itself within the horror genre but does so with a blend of psychological tension, supernatural elements, and emotional depth that make it stand apart from standard jump-scare-driven horror films. At its core, the movie delivers on the key expectations of horror: suspense, fear, and a menacing antagonist, but it also leans heavily into thriller and coming-of-age drama, creating a hybrid experience that broadens its appeal. One of the strongest aspects of its genre execution is how it uses fear not only as a means to shock, but as a tool to explore vulnerability, survival, and resilience. Rather than overwhelming the viewer with constant loud scares, the film builds dread slowly, relying on atmosphere, silence, and the ever-present threat of the grabber to keep audiences on edge. This restraint is a refreshing approach in modern horror, which often opts for fast-paced, over-the-top frights. Classic horror beats are present throughout. The presence of a child predator who operates from a mysterious house evokes familiar real-world fears, and the idea of being trapped in a confined space with minimal escape routes is a trope that continues to be effective when executed well. The film uses these conventions as a foundation but enhances them through its supernatural layer, the Black Phone itself, which allows communication with past victims. This element injects a ghostly presence into the narrative that feels organic rather than forced, creating a bridge between psychological horror and the paranormal. The inclusion of this device also prevents the story from becoming too predictable, as the advice and guidance from the spirits shift the power dynamic between Finney and the grabber over time. Where the film refreshes the genre is in its emotional core. Many horror movies focus solely on terror without developing their characters in meaningful ways, but The Black Phone invests time in making its young protagonist sympathetic and resourceful. His bond with his sister, his struggles at home, and his determination to survive all create an emotional through line that makes the horror more impactful. This merging of coming-of-age storytelling with horror is reminiscent of works like It or Stranger Things, where childhood innocence collides with unspeakable evil, but here it is more contained and intimate. The result is a horror film that carries emotional stakes alongside its scares, making victories feel more earned and moments of terror more potent. The film also avoids some common clichés. It does not rely excessively on cheap jump scares, nor does it drown its tension in unnecessary gore. While it contains violent moments, they serve the story rather than becoming the story. The antagonist, the grabber, is unsettling because of his unpredictability and eerie mask rather than any elaborate backstory or exaggerated theatrics. By keeping him enigmatic and grounded, the film sidesteps the trap of over-explaining its monster and instead focuses on the perspective of the victim. However, the movie does lean on certain familiar elements that genre fans will recognize instantly. The concept of a child being kidnapped by a sinister figure is a well-trodden theme, and the use of supernatural communication from the dead is not entirely novel. Some viewers may feel that the narrative progression, captivity, attempts to escape, and final confrontation, follows a familiar arc. Yet, the execution is sharp enough that these expected beats do not feel stale. Instead, they provide a comforting structure for the audience while allowing the film's unique touches to shine. For fans of horror who appreciate a balance between supernatural eeriness and grounded human fear, The black phone delivers what they seek while offering something slightly different. Those expecting relentless action or gore-heavy sequences may find the pacing more restrained, but this controlled approach allows the tension to linger and the atmosphere to seep into every frame. The film honors the rules of its genre but adds enough personality, emotional resonance, and creative twists to avoid feeling derivative. In this way, it both respects the expectations of horror and refreshes them, creating a story that feels timeless yet contemporary. The Black Phone, 2022, operates primarily as a horror thriller, but beneath its supernatural and suspenseful layers, it carries subtle threads of social and cultural commentary that enrich its narrative. Set in the late 1970s, the film reflects a time marked by heightened concerns about child abductions, domestic dysfunction, and a lack of systemic protection for vulnerable individuals. One of the most prominent social undertones is the depiction of neglect within family and community structures. Finney and Gwen live under the shadow of an abusive, alcoholic father, and the film does not shy away from showing how such domestic instability leaves children more susceptible to external dangers. This commentary resonates even in modern contexts, where cycles of abuse and neglect often go unaddressed until tragedy strikes. Another layer of cultural commentary emerges through the theme of ignored or underestimated children. In the story, it is the children, both living and dead, who ultimately resist the grabber and outwit his cruelty. Adults, including the police, the school system, and even the father, are either slow to act or ineffective in protecting them. This reflects a broader critique of how society has historically dismissed the fears and instincts of young people, treating them as secondary voices rather than individuals capable of insight and agency. Gwen's visions, for example, are initially brushed off as nonsense, despite them holding the key to uncovering the truth. Her persistence in the face of disbelief reinforces the idea that children's perspectives, intuition, and resilience are often undervalued in adult-dominated systems. The film also touches on the darker aspects of suburban safety myths. The seemingly quiet, ordinary neighborhood becomes a hunting ground for the grabber, exposing the illusion of security in familiar environments. This reflects a cultural anxiety that was especially potent during the period in which the story is set, an era where high-profile cases of missing children began to reshape parental vigilance and public awareness. The grabber's ability to operate unnoticed for so long mirrors real-world failures of law enforcement and community oversight during that time. While the movie does not present an overtly political agenda, its portrayal of violence against children and the failings of authority figures can be interpreted as a critique of how institutions often prioritize order over protection. The police, for much of the film, seem reactive rather than proactive, relying on limited leads and ignoring unconventional help like Gwen's dreams. This resonates with ongoing discussions about the gaps in how missing children cases are handled, both then and now. The film's handling of these themes is generally subtle and sensitive rather than exploitative. It does not sensationalize abuse or trauma for shock value, but integrates these elements into the narrative to build stakes and tension. However, some might argue that certain issues, particularly the father's abuse, are introduced more as a character-defining trait than as a fully explored subject. The resolution of his arc, where his remorse is shown briefly, feels somewhat underdeveloped compared to the weight the early scenes give his violence. This could be seen as an oversimplification of the complex realities of familial abuse and recovery. Culturally, the story also celebrates resilience and the idea of community among victims, even in death. The voices on the Black Phone represent a kind of collective resistance, showing how shared trauma can lead to empowerment rather than silence. This theme resonates with modern conversations about breaking cycles of victimization and giving a voice to the voiceless. Overall, The Black Phone, 2022, does not position itself as a socially charged film, but its undercurrents speak to enduring anxieties about childhood vulnerability, institutional shortcomings, and the failure of adults to protect those most at risk. These elements do not overshadow its horror narrative, but rather give it a grounded, haunting relevance that lingers beyond the final act. The Black Phone, 2022, is crafted to engage its audience on multiple emotional levels, blending fear, suspense, and moments of emotional vulnerability that keep viewers invested long after the credits roll. One of the most engaging elements is its ability to build genuine dread without relying solely on jump scares. The scenes where Finney is alone in the basement, listening to the ghostly voices on the Black Phone, are likely to make viewers hold their breath. Each call reveals a piece of the puzzle while heightening the tension, and audiences often find themselves leaning in, trying to catch every word. These sequences are not just frightening, they invite speculation and discussion, as viewers debate the origins and motivations of the ghostly helpers and how their fragmented messages come together. The relationship between Finney and Gwen provides another strong emotional hook. Scenes depicting their bond, especially when Gwen prays for her brother's safety despite the fear of punishment from their abusive father, tug at the heartstrings and add a layer of emotional resonance uncommon in typical horror films. These moments allow audiences to connect with the story on a human level, making the stakes feel more personal and the ultimate triumph more satisfying. The moment when Gwen's visions begin aligning with the investigation is particularly powerful, sparking audience excitement and a sense of hope amid the darkness. Signature moments designed for lasting impact include the first full reveal of the grabber's mask, the eerie quiet of his basement lair, and the final showdown where Finney uses both his wit and the advice of the previous victims to turn the tables on his captor. The construction of the trap and the use of the black phone as a weapon are especially memorable, offering both a cathartic payoff for the tension built throughout the film and a visual that fans are likely to discuss or share. This climax, with its combination of supernatural aid and human determination, provides the kind of resolution that invites applause in theaters and satisfaction upon rewatch. The film also encourages subtle fan theories, particularly surrounding the supernatural elements. Viewers may debate whether the black phone is truly haunted or a manifestation of Finney's survival instinct and trauma. Gwen's psychic dreams similarly leave room for interpretation. Are they a gift, a curse, or a symbolic narrative tool? Such ambiguities encourage discussion, keeping the film alive in online forums and conversations well beyond its release. Rewatchability is enhanced by the film's careful attention to detail. Small hints and visual cues scatter throughout the basement, as well as the evolving positioning of objects Finney uses in his escape, reward attentive viewers. On repeat viewings, audiences notice how early foreshadowing ties into later revelations, such as the layout of the room, the dog's presence, or the grabber's unpredictable routines. These layered details make the film feel meticulously constructed rather than relying purely on shock value. Some scenes may also find a life of their own in digital culture. The unsettling image of the grabber sitting silently in his chair waiting for Finney to make a mistake, or when riding her bike through empty streets under a heavy sky, are visually striking and easily adapted into GIFs or shared clips. These moments encapsulate the film's eerie tone and its ability to create memorable, haunting snapshots. Ultimately, The Black Phone, 2022, engages audiences by mixing fear with empathy. It is not only the scares that resonate but also the triumph of a boy overcoming impossible odds, the bond of siblings who refuse to give up on each other, and the lingering spirits of those who never escaped yet still fight for justice. These elements create an emotional aftertaste that leads viewers to recommend the film, revisit it for hidden details, and debate its unanswered questions, ensuring it remains relevant in discussions among horror enthusiasts and casual audiences alike. When comparing The Black Phone, 2022, to other films within the horror and thriller genre, as well as to the previous work of its director Scott Derrickson, several influences and parallels become evident that help frame its strengths and areas where it falls slightly short. Derrickson, known for directing Sinister, 2012, and Doctor Strange, 2016, brings a familiar blend of supernatural tension and grounded realism to this project. Much like Sinister, The Black Phone features a menacing antagonist, a sense of creeping dread, and a heavy use of atmospheric tension over explicit gore. Both films share a slow burn approach, allowing fear to build gradually rather than rushing into overexposed frights, and in this respect, The Black Phone succeeds in recapturing some of the chilling unease that made Sinister so effective. A natural point of comparison is It, 2017, another story about children confronting an overwhelming evil figure in a suburban setting. Both films blend childhood vulnerability with horror, use a 1970s or 1980s backdrop to emphasize nostalgia and isolation, and incorporate a group of young characters who band together or communicate in unusual ways to survive. However, The Black Phone is more contained, with a tighter focus on one victim and a handful of spirits rather than a large ensemble cast. This creates a more intimate narrative, but it also means it does not have the sprawling mythos or the same level of world building that it achieved. For viewers expecting a more expansive exploration of its supernatural elements, The Black Phone may feel deliberately restrained. Another close thematic cousin is Stranger Things, particularly in its use of psychic visions, missing children, and an atmosphere steeped in the anxieties of a bygone era. Yet while Stranger Things often leans into adventure and camaraderie, The Black Phone maintains a much darker, more suffocating tone. Its horror is less about external monsters and more about the terrifying reality of human predators combined with the uncanny presence of the supernatural. Comparing it to The Silence of the Lambs, 1991, also yields interesting insights, particularly in the way both films portray captivity, psychological manipulation, and the tension between captor and captive. However, where Silence of the Lambs delves deeply into the psyche of both the killer and the investigator, The Black Phone keeps the grabber enigmatic, offering only hints about his motivations. Some viewers may find this approach refreshing, as it leaves more to the imagination, while others might feel it limits the depth of the villain. Within Scott Derrickson's own filmography, The Black Phone stands out for its balance between horror and emotional storytelling. Doctor Strange showcased his ability to handle spectacle and surreal imagery, while Deliver Us from Evil, 2014, explored the darker side of faith and possession. Here, Derrickson merges his supernatural sensibilities with a more intimate, character-driven narrative. This synthesis works to his advantage, grounding the story even when ghostly elements come into play. Where the film borrows smartly is in its use of minimalism. Many modern horror films clutter their narratives with elaborate mythologies or excessive visual effects, but The Black Phone relies on a handful of locations, a simple premise, and a strong central performance to drive tension. This recalls classic one-location thrillers like Panic Room, 2002, or Misery, 1990, where suspense is mined from confinement and limited resources. However, it falls short in comparison to some of the most innovative psychological horror films of recent years, such as Hereditary, 2018, or The Babadook, 2014, which layer their supernatural horrors with deeply symbolic or metaphorical explorations of trauma. While The Black Phone touches on abuse, neglect, and resilience, it does not always probe those themes with the same level of nuance or complexity, opting instead for a more straightforward survival narrative. Overall, The Black Phone positions itself as a lean, effective entry in the horror genre that stands closer to the classic slow-burn thrillers of the past than to the heavily stylized, metaphor-rich horror that has defined parts of the modern era. It borrows familiar beats from iconic works but retools them with a focused scope, creating a film that feels familiar yet fresh enough to engage both casual viewers and genre fans. Symbolism and metaphors in The Black Phone, 2022, play an important role in giving depth to the story beyond its surface-level horror narrative. Throughout the film, objects, colors, and recurring motifs serve as a bridge between the visible action and the deeper psychological or emotional truths the characters experience. One of the clearest examples is The Black Phone itself, which is not just a plot device but a metaphor for communication across barriers, life and death, the present and the past, isolation and connection. The disconnected phone represents the idea that even when someone feels entirely cut off, there are ways voices from the past can still guide and protect. It reflects the theme of finding strength from those who came before and using their experiences to survive. The phone ringing becomes a symbol of hope in the midst of terror, an unusual reversal of a device typically used in horror to signal dread. Colors are used symbolically as well. Darkness dominates the kidnapper's basement, emphasizing fear, uncertainty, and loss of control, while faint light filtering through the window becomes a symbol of distant freedom. The contrast between shadow and dim light carries the emotional weight of the protagonist's struggle, each flicker of brightness suggesting that escape or rescue is possible, even when most of the screen is cloaked in gloom. Similarly, the mask worn by the antagonist acts as a metaphor for hidden identity and suppressed humanity. The shifting expressions on the mask, smiling, neutral, or angry, mirror the unpredictable danger of the abductor's moods and create a symbolic language of their own, representing the duality of menace and vulnerability. Repeated motifs, such as the phone calls from the dead children, also function as metaphors for memory and unresolved trauma. These voices from the past do not simply recount their fates, they embody the collective resilience of victims who refuse to be erased. Each message passed to the protagonist carries symbolic weight, turning their tragic endings into a means of salvation for someone else. The chain of guidance reflects a theme that runs beneath the horror, that suffering can, in some cases, leave behind strength for those still fighting. The basement itself becomes a metaphorical space of transformation, a dark cocoon where fear is confronted, innocence is tested, and survival instincts are awakened. Even small set details and actions carry layered meanings. The act of digging, scratching, or attempting escape again and again represents persistence against overwhelming odds, turning mundane movements into metaphors for resilience. The broken, dirty, and bare surroundings mirror the psychological imprisonment the boy faces, while each tool or clue he uncovers takes on symbolic weight as a fragment of hope. In this way, symbolism in The Black Phone enriches the viewing experience, offering layers that reveal more on reflection. Viewers who pay attention to these recurring elements may find that the film speaks not only about a boy's physical escape but also about the universal fight to break free from fear, isolation, and control. The Black Phone, 2022, is not part of an established franchise in the traditional sense, but its place in the landscape of modern horror gives it a contextual weight worth exploring. Directed by Scott Derrickson and based on a short story by Joe Hill, it carries influences from past horror traditions while existing as a standalone narrative. There are no direct sequels, prequels, or extended cinematic universes tied to it yet, but the film has sparked discussions about its potential to develop into a series because of its strong central concept and the mythology it begins to build. In terms of callbacks, the film feels like a spiritual continuation of earlier works in the horror and thriller genre, particularly those that mix supernatural elements with grounded, real-world fears. It has echoes of 1970s and 1980s horror cinema in its aesthetic, setting, and focus on childhood vulnerability, which places it historically within a nostalgic yet unsettling timeline. The film is set in the late 1970s, and its period details contribute significantly to its authenticity. From the design of the houses and streets to the clothing, dialogue, and cultural references, the film recreates an era marked by both innocence and a lurking sense of danger. The decision to place the story in that period is not just cosmetic. It reflects a time when child safety was perceived differently, technology was limited, and communities functioned with more isolation. This historical context heightens the stakes because the protagonist's plight feels more plausible in a world without mobile phones, GPS, or rapid communication, where missing children could easily go unnoticed for longer stretches. The accuracy of this portrayal is one of the film's strengths, and while it may take minor liberties in compressing or dramatizing certain social realities, it largely respects the mood and limitations of the time. There are also subtle nods to the horror tradition from which it draws. Fans of Derrickson's earlier work, such as Sinister, may recognize thematic parallels: the haunted past, children in peril, and a supernatural element tied to memory and trauma. While these are not explicit Easter eggs, they form a loose continuity of style and narrative interest that audiences familiar with his films can appreciate. In this sense, The Black Phone can be read as part of a lineage of horror stories that explore the intersection between the paranormal and the psychological. The absence of direct franchise ties allows the film to stand alone, but it also leaves space for interpretation and expansion. Viewers have speculated about potential prequels that could explore the antagonist's history or sequels that might delve into other victims or similar supernatural encounters. As it stands, the film's historical accuracy, attention to its era, and subtle callbacks to genre traditions give it a unique position in contemporary horror, rooted in the past, resonating in the present, and open-ended enough to inspire future storytelling without being bound to strict continuity. The Black Phone, 2022, was produced on a relatively modest budget compared to many modern horror films that often rely on excessive special effects or high-profile casts to draw attention. Reports suggest that the production budget was around $18 million, a figure that aligns with Blumhouse Productions' reputation for creating commercially successful horror films with restrained spending. The film's visual presentation, including its authentic 1970s setting, practical effects, and minimal but effective supernatural sequences, makes it appear well-crafted without being overly polished or reliant on extravagant resources. This balance between cost control and quality production design is one of the reasons the movie managed to feel both intimate and cinematic at the same time. When evaluating how the budget reflects on screen, it is clear that much of the investment went into creating a believable period atmosphere and maintaining tension through lighting, set design, and sound rather than through expensive CGI or elaborate set pieces. The casting choices also support this approach, with a mix of experienced actors like Ethan Hawke and talented young performers who deliver strong performances without commanding blockbuster-level salaries. This strategy allowed more of the budget to be directed toward the film's production values, rather than being consumed by star power alone. The box office performance of The Black Phone significantly exceeded expectations for a mid-budget horror film. Released during a period when theatrical attendance was still recovering from the pandemic, it managed to generate strong word-of-mouth and critical reception, which contributed to its financial success. The film grossed over $160 million worldwide, making it a substantial hit relative to its cost. Its success can be attributed not only to its compelling story and effective marketing but also to a release strategy that positioned it as a must-see event for horror enthusiasts during the summer of 2022, a time typically dominated by larger-scale blockbusters. Marketing played a strategic role in building anticipation without overspending. Trailers highlighted its unsettling premise, mysterious villain, and supernatural twist, while also leaning on the recognizable name of its director and the involvement of Joe Hill as the source author. Blumhouse's track record in horror created an additional layer of trust with audiences, further fueling its box office momentum. Beyond opening weekend, strong reviews and audience reactions ensured it maintained a presence in theaters for an extended period rather than dropping off quickly as many horror releases often do. Overall, The Black Phone is an example of how a well-executed lower-budget film can deliver exceptional financial results without the need for massive spectacle or an inflated budget. Its production choices and release strategy allowed it to punch far above its weight, showing that a clear creative vision combined with controlled spending and strong marketing can lead to major box office success. The Black Phone, 2022, offers multiple viewing options, allowing audiences to choose the setting that best enhances its chilling atmosphere and tense narrative. For those who experienced it during its theatrical release, the film's dark tone, haunting score, and immersive sound design made the big screen a compelling choice. The controlled lighting and surround sound of a theater amplified its unsettling mood, particularly in scenes where silence and sudden sound cues are essential to building tension. Watching it in this setting also added to the communal horror experience, where audience reactions like gasps and moments of suspense became part of the enjoyment. For home viewers, the film is widely accessible on major streaming platforms and through digital rental or purchase. This makes it a flexible option for those who prefer to experience horror in a more intimate and controlled environment. Watching at home allows for greater focus on the details, the subtle performances, the set design that reflects the 1970s setting, and the eerie use of shadows and muted colors. A darkened room with minimal distractions can create an atmosphere close to the theatrical experience, particularly if paired with good speakers or headphones to fully capture the nuances of the score and sound effects. Headphones, in particular, heighten the film's psychological tension, as many scenes rely on faint whispers, distant noises, or the haunting ring of the black phone itself to unsettle the viewer. The immersive audio experience helps bring out the film's most disturbing layers, especially during moments when the supernatural elements and the presence of the grabber seem to blend with the oppressive stillness of the basement setting. This makes home viewing with quality audio equipment an excellent alternative for those seeking a deep, atmospheric experience. For casual viewers or those less accustomed to intense horror, watching The Black Phone in a relaxed home environment during the evening or night can still deliver its intended impact without overwhelming the senses. The story is not purely reliant on jump scares but builds a gradual sense of dread, which allows for flexible viewing styles, whether in one sitting or paused intermittently. However, watching in daylight or with frequent interruptions may reduce its suspense, as the film thrives on its ability to pull audiences into its tense, confined spaces. Overall, the best way to watch The Black Phone depends on the kind of experience desired. For a cinematic, edge-of-the-seat encounter, a theater or home theater setup with surround sound is ideal. For a personal psychological engagement with its eerie themes, headphones and a dark room at home work remarkably well. Its availability on streaming platforms also makes it convenient for multiple rewatches, where viewers can pick up on foreshadowing, hidden details, and subtle clues that enrich the story. Whether seen on a large screen or through a carefully curated home setup, the film's atmosphere and craftsmanship remain strong, making it a versatile choice for both seasoned horror fans and curious first-time viewers. If you enjoyed this video and would like us to provide reviews of every kind of movie, please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. Have a great day, and we'll see you in the next video.
Goodbye.